Hey guys, Will here. So it's been a number of years now since we've seen a new wheelbase launch from Fanatec. And in the time since the last one, there's been a lot of new brands that have exploded onto the scene. Some other brands that already existed have really carried things forward as well. And yeah, Fanatec have somewhat been left behind, I guess you could say. Now, they came back swinging just a little while ago now with their launch of the QR2 quick release, which addressed one of the biggest issues that people had with their ecosystem. We covered that on the channel here just recently, and they've come out swinging now again with their brand new ClubSport wheelbases, the DD, which is a 12 Newton meter holding torque, Xbox and PC compatible wheelbase, and their DD Plus, which is a 15 Newton meter holding torque wheelbase, PlayStation and PC compatible straight out of the box, and also Xbox compatible if you have an Xbox compatible wheel, which you can put onto the wheelbase. So these are filling what I've been personally saying is a gaping big hole in Fanatec's direct drive lineup, right in the sweet spot of what I consider to be the ideal torque level for the majority of more serious sim races. Now, not only that, but these new wheelbases also introduce a new direct drive technology for Fanatec called FullForce, and that aims to give drivers even more detail in the force feedback than has been previously possible. So are the ClubSport DD and DD Plus the final death blow from Fanatec to the competition? Well, we've been putting these two bases through their paces over the last week and a half now, testing them pretty much against the entire competition, as you can see behind me. And now it's time to share our impressions. So if you're hyped for this video, you can do us a big favor by jumping down. You'll see that we're very, very close to 300,000 subscribers. So it would be absolutely amazing if you guys could help bump us up over that threshold. Let's get started on this video. Okay guys, so we've got a lot to get through in today's video. We've been posting a couple of things on social media recently, asking you guys for any questions that you have, and we're gonna do our absolute best today to get through as much of that as we possibly can within the context of what we have in front of us here. So there's a couple of important things that you need to understand to give you the context of what we're doing in today's video. So first things first, a big thank you to Fanatec for sending across this gear for us to check out today. Now, it's important that you understand that the DD Plus base that we have here today is a early production model. The DD that we have here is a mass production model. So what we mean by early production is this is one of the first production runs that they put through the factory. All of the output from that first production run they generally use for marketing purposes, demonstrations. It was one of these bases that they used at the ADAC conference, for example, just recently. So what that means is they're able to iron out any little bugs in the manufacturing that they pick up before they move across to mass production. So what that means for you guys is that what we see here in today's video, whilst being, pretty much exactly the same as mass production, there may be a couple of little changes between the two. So just important to be aware of that. Because of that, there are a couple of little things that they've asked us not to show you guys. I'll explain that to you as we go through today's video, just because there'll be a couple of things that you're like, why didn't he show that? That's the reason why, but I'll highlight those as we go through today's video. On the software side of things, that has an impact as well. So all of the driving tests that we've been doing up to this point have been with early software. As you guys know, software and firmware has an absolutely massive impact on the overall driving experience. Probably actually more important these days than the hardware itself, it could be argued. So it's important that you guys are aware, early software at this point too. What that means in a practical sense is that things should only improve from here onwards. Now, there is one other important thing as well, just with regards to FullForce, that new force feedback technology that I was talking about earlier. At the moment, we are just running a demo of that. It's exactly the same demo that you would have seen at the ADAC conference just recently as well. So the way that FullForce works, just at a top level, we'll explain this in more detail later on. It's basically an API or application programming interface, which integrates at a game level to allow them to access telemetry data and generate force feedback effects from that with minimal latency. So at the time that we're filming this, that integration isn't in place for any games just yet, but we do have a working demonstration. And they tell me that that gives an accurate representation of what FullForce should feel like. And again, it should only improve from what we're talking about in today's video. But just wanted to make sure you guys were absolutely clear on exactly the context of what we're looking at here. They have asked for the DD Plus back, and they will be replacing that with a retail mass production unit, hopefully very soon. And when they do that, we'll be doing a separate review on both of these wheelbases where we go into more detail. And that's when we were doing our more direct comparisons head-to-head against manufacturers. But as I mentioned, we have been going through and testing these guys over the last week and a half now, and retesting all of the existing wheelbases that we have in our inventory as well, just to refresh all of our knowledge, make sure that everything that we're saying is based off the latest software and drivers. So we've got as even a playing field as we possibly can here today, but we will be trying to give you just a general overall impression of what you can expect from these products, rather than over analyzing things too much and potentially being a little bit misleading, given that the driving experience should improve as things move forward. And that's definitely been the case with pretty much every brand that we've seen over the years. As the products evolve, as the software evolves, the driving experience only really just gets better and better over time. So that is all the important things that you need to know. If you do want to pick up any of the gear that you see in today's video as well, whether that be from Fanatec or any of the other brands that we talk about, there are some affiliate links down in the description below. Those are an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you guys. And that's just available if you guys find what we do here useful and you want to help support us. So we really do appreciate your support there. But let's move on now into the DD Plus and DD wheelbases. So what do we have here in terms of pricing? Now, you guys are probably already familiar with the fact that PlayStation licensing specifically does cost a lot of money, and generally they find some way to pass that cost onto the customer. Now, what they've done here with the DD and DD Plus bases is a little bit different from what we've seen from Fanatec in the past. So the CSDD, as I mentioned earlier, is 12 Newton meters holding torque, whereas the PlayStation compatible version, the DD Plus, is 15 Newton meters holding torque. So there is quite a significant price difference between the two bases, but at least you are getting something a little bit extra in terms of the experience, rather than just that PlayStation compatibility. So let's run you through quickly now. So the ClubSport DD comes in at $1,229.95, including GST if you're in Australia. That is $699.95 plus tax and shipping if you're in the US, or €699.95 including VAT if you're in Europe. As always, just check your local shipping costs, import duties, and all those important things to make sure that that information is going to be relevant to you specifically. Then stepping up to the DD Plus, which is this guy on my left here, you're looking at $1,649.95 Australian, including GST, $999.95 plus tax if you're in the US, or $999.95 including VAT in Europe. As I said, we will be unpacking and comparing these more directly in future videos with specific other wheelbases. So let us know what you would like to see in terms of comparison down in the comments below. Just to give you a quick rundown on some competitive pricing here for some of the key ones that I know you guys are wondering about. Obviously, you can check pricing for yourselves as well, but the Moza R12, for example, 12 Newton meter peak, not to be confused with 12 Newton meter holding torque, of course, which is what we have here. You're looking at $589 US plus tax for that guy. The Moza R16, which is actually probably a little bit more closely matched in terms of torque levels to what these guys are like. You're looking at $799 US plus tax. Something like the Acertec La Prima wheelbase, which is 12 Newton meter peak torque, that comes in at $749.99 plus tax in the US. And the Forte base from Acertec by comparison as well, which is 18 Newton meter peak. Again, probably a little bit more similar to what we have here than the La Prima is in terms of what it feels like to drive with in terms of the torque level at least. You're looking at $1,049.99 US plus tax on that guy. And I think it's worth including here as well, just quickly, the SimMagic Alpha Mini. That is marketed as a 10 Newton meter peak base, but again, that does feel a little bit stronger than that 10 Newton meters. It feels probably more like a 12 Newton meter peak wheelbase. So a little bit weaker than what these guys are, but that guy comes in at $539 US plus tax. So quite a bit cheaper. Now, there is quite a bit of variation there in terms of the strength levels. So it's really going to come down to what's going to be best value for you in terms of how much strength you think you actually need. Now, before we move on into looking into more details on these bases specifically, I want to address one thing which I think is really important here, and that is the fact that, look, honestly, I know everybody is kind of trying to find something to kind of highlight as being a feature that's better about one base than another, you know, reasons why you would want to pick one thing over another thing. Now, as I said earlier, we've been spending quite a lot of time, probably close to 30 or 40 hours of just driving with various different wheelbases over the last week and a half. And look, my overarching impression driving with pretty much everything, again with the latest drivers and software, is that honestly, guys, everything is pretty darn good these days. There are subtle nuances in various different bases, things that I subjectively prefer in some brands to others. But I think really what's giving the most differentiation these days between different brands is things more like the build quality of the hardware, the completeness of the ecosystem, the quality of the software, the game level integration, what it's actually like to use in terms of simplicity, all those important factors. So we're going to be focusing on that pretty heavily in today's video as well. But I wanted to sort of, I guess, establish a baseline here and remind you guys that these days everything is pretty darn good. The best sim racing equipment is of course the equipment that you have or the equipment that you can afford. And I think it's really important for that reason to start this off by saying that, you know, yes, these bases are very, very, very good, but it is absolutely unequivocally not the case that everybody should be panic selling the equipment that they have now and, you know, making a loss to buy these guys. They are very good, but they're not so good that they just absolutely completely destroy everything else on the market. So I wanted to start off by saying that just to get your expectations kind of in the right ballpark before we drill in and unpack these guys in more detail. But let's go ahead now and do exactly that. So the first important thing that you guys need to know is that the physical motors themselves are actually identical between the two models. So as you can see here, exactly the same physical form factor between the two of them. However, the electronics are different between the two. So a lot of people have been asking, will there be some sort of a boost pack available to step the 12 Newton meter version up to 15 Newton meters? No, there won't be. In fact, the power supplies that are shipped with both of these models are mechanically identical, exactly the same ratings between both of them. So there's not going to be any sort of a boost pack available. It's all in the software, firmware, and the electronics, which we'll take a look at a little bit later on in today's video. So I'll flash some dimensions up on the screen for you guys now, and I'm just going to set one of these guys aside and bring in my GT DD Pro. So you can see here in terms of the physical size, as you look at it face on, they are identical. The new model is just longer than the old model was. So all of the physical mounting properties carry across from the CSL DD and GT DD Pro. So you've got mounting channels in the sides here for some T-nuts on both sides, so you can side mount them. You also have some rails in the bottom here as well. And you can see the T-nuts that are installed here. The only difference between the two, of course, being that the channels are physically longer on the new one, which gives you a little bit more scope for movement and adjustment on the rig. But otherwise, the spacing is all absolutely the same, which means it will fit on all of your existing cockpits, mounting plates, and such like. Now, one thing that I did notice that I really appreciated is the T-nuts that they include with these new bases now do include a little spring ball. And what that means is that, as you can see here, the T-nuts don't just flop around and slide when you're trying to mount the thing, which does make it a lot easier to mount on your rig than it was with the flat T-nuts that didn't have any sort of spring relief in the CSL DD and GT DD Pro previously. I don't know whether they now include these with these guys too, but at the time that they shipped these guys out to us, they certainly didn't. So that was something that I appreciated straight out of the box. Obviously something that they've listened to feedback and made some adaptations on. Now, the other thing in terms of physical footprint and layout, form factor and whatnot, that a lot of people are going to be wondering about is the length of the stem here. So I'm going to set both of these guys up on their bottoms here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pop a wheel on, and I'm going to measure the distance for you between the back of the wheel here, the furthest point, and the front of the motor here, because I know this is something a lot of people were concerned about. So we'll pop it on quickly into place, and I'll grab my little measuring implement here. Now, obviously every wheel is going to be a little bit different, but what we're interested in here is the difference between the measurement on this one compared to this one, because that's what's going to impact you guys at home. So we're going to measure from the bottom here just to the faceplate here, and I've got a measurement here of about 79 millimeters. Let's just call it 80 millimeters between here and the back of the wheel. I'll pop it onto the GT DD Pro as well, if I can get it off. There we go. Slide that across gently there. Let's pop it on this guy too. So what did I say? I said 80 millimeters on the previous one. So let's measure the same thing again. Spin the wheel around. And we've got a measurement of 115 millimeters. Now, I did do that exact same measurement on my DD1 and DD2 as well, and it's actually exactly the same measurement, 115 millimeters, give or take a few, to what it is on the CSL DD and GT DD Pro. So what that means is that the wheel is going to sit about 35 millimeters closer to the base on these new CSDD and CSDD Plus models. Whether or not that's going to be an issue for you is going to be up to you to decide, but at least now you have the measurement so you can check it for yourself. What they have told me is that there will be some sort of a shaft extension accessory available for these guys. Don't know what that's going to look like or how it's going to work just yet, when it'll be available or what the cost will be. I'm sure it won't be cheap, but hopefully I'll be pleasantly surprised there. But it is something that they are actively working on and will be available hopefully before too long. Now, the other thing important to understand with regards to the quick release, if you saw our short the other day, you would have seen that we already talked about this, but I wanted to highlight this for you because this is something that I thought was really interesting. So if you saw our recent review of FANATEC'S new QR2 quick release system, you'll already be aware of this. And if you haven't seen that video, I would definitely recommend check it out, particularly if you're looking at buying into the FANATEC ecosystem for the first time, because it is something that is very important to wrap your head around and a big improvement over the previous system that you might have seen a lot of people commenting about online. But both on the CSL DD and GT DD Pro, as well as the DD1 and DD2, there's an electrical connection within the quick release itself. So on the GT DD Pro and CSL DD, it looks like this guy. So when you are upgrading from the QR1 to the QR2, remembering that these at the moment at least ship with a QR1 pre-installed, it looks like this, and basically there's a little USB-C connection using a proprietary protocol on the back of it. So what you had to do is undo the clamp, slide it out, slide the new one in, replace the clamp with their new improved clamp, which hopefully will do away with the issues that we saw with disconnections on this guy specifically. And then you're good to go with the QR2. Similarly on the DD1 and DD2 as well, you had a clamp that you had to undo, and then there are a couple of electrical plugs. And you can see here that you're actually replacing the pin receptacle and everything that kind of goes along with that. What they've done with this new CSDD and DD Plus, which I think is really smart, is they've actually made the electrical connection a physical part of the motor shaft itself. And then the actual quick release itself is just a sleeve essentially, which bolts in over the top using 4 bolts here. Now, this is one of the things that they told us was likely to change a little bit between pre-production and mass production. Although this is a mass production unit, I'm not sure that this guy is. So they have asked me to not actually show on camera installing this, but I can tell you that it's as simple as just undoing the 4 bolts. You just slide this guy off, and then the other guy slides on, and I'll include some footage of this guy installed. Now, a lot of people will be wondering what is the advantage of QR2 pertaining to the new DD and DD Plus specifically. I can tell you that even with the demonstration that we were running for FullForce, the force feedback effects do feel a little bit more pronounced, a little sharper, and a little bit more detailed with the QR2. So it is good that they give you the option at least to downgrade these new bases to a QR1 if you're not ready to upgrade all of your existing wheels. But I would recommend, if you can afford it, it's not a deal breaker by any means, but if you can afford it, the best experience is definitely to be had with the QR2. And again, check out our QR2 full review for all the breakdown of the nuances in that. So we touched on the fact that both the DD and DD Plus are identical physical motors, other than just the electronics and the power supplies being identical as well. Let's just give you a quick look at those power supplies. So this is the power supply that came with the ClubSport DD Plus. I've already labeled them so I don't get them muddled up, even though they are identical, just because I like to keep everything in batches together. But ClubSport DD, ClubSport DD Plus, absolutely identical physically. And if I quickly have a look at the stats on here as well, just to read them out to you, it is a switch mode power supply, so it's suitable from 100 volts AC all the way through to 240 volts AC. And the output on both of these is 24 volts DC at 14.17 amps, which equates to 340.08 watts. Now, we've got a nice thick power supply cable on here. It's a FT1 80 degrees C 300 volts 16 AWG cable, for those who might be wondering, and they're using a Molex style connector on the end of it with a little push button here that clips into the power supply receptacle on the back of the base. So we'll just quickly plug that in for you guys as well. You can see it just plugs in on this side, down here, clips in, and then to unclip it, you just push on the tab. A little bit tricky because it kind of sits in behind the ring here, but you can kind of get your thumb in there and push it down and it just releases like so. So it's not going to come out by accident, but it is something that if you step on the cable, it'll obviously damage the connection quite easily. So it's worth just securing the cable somewhere else on your rig as well, just to ensure that that never happens. Set these power supplies down, and while we're around the back here, I want to talk about some of the other inputs and outputs on the back of the bases as well. So I'm going to pull the DD Plus into the shot again as well, just to show you that they are both identical to each other than just the difference in color on the back here. with the blue signifying PlayStation compatibility. So a couple of interesting observations here. Firstly, you'll notice there is a little CAN bus port here. Now we've noticed CAN bus being integrated on quite a few products recently, but yet to see any accessories myself that actually use this. So it'll be interesting to see how this might be utilized into the future. But CAN bus is basically a protocol for communicating with accessories that uses a digital address for each address on a daisy chain rather than having to have a separate circuit for every single component. So it's commonly used in vehicles these days, and it allows the various different components within the car to communicate with each other without having to have a separate line to each individual component, if that makes sense. So CAN bus on the back here, power as we already talked about. One thing that you may have already noticed here is that there isn't provision for connecting an emergency stop button like what we have on the DD1 and the DD2. So that is one thing I'm not super impressed by. I think that on a wheelbase this powerful, whether it be the 12 Newton meter or the 15 Newton meter holding torque version that you're looking at, you kind of do need to have an emergency stop button. I don't know what the actual legal requirements are around that, but for me, I have been caught out a couple of times now where I've had a wheel go crazy, or and I've had my hand inside, or I've been doing something that I probably shouldn't have been doing and had a wheel go crazy and had to hit that emergency stop button. It's one of those things, you don't need it until you do, and when you have it, you'll be thankful one day that you did have it. So yeah, not sure exactly what the reason is for not having provision for that anymore. It would have been an easy upsell, I think, to sell an accessory that they could have made a little bit more money from. So not sure exactly what the reason is for that. I'm sure they have a good one, and I'm sure that they've checked all the legal requirements as well. But it is just an observation there. We're going to have standard connections here for shifter 1, shifter 2, pedals and handbrake. Now obviously that is very important because if you are running on a console, you will have to connect all of those various accessories through to the wheelbase rather than individually connecting them via USB, because consoles typically only understand one physical input from a device, so everything has to run back through the base. So good that they have all those standard connections there, remembering of course that they are by default only compatible with other Fanatec accessories, although there are ways of hacking things and modifying outputs to make other devices work with these. But just be aware that you're not going to be plugging in your Mozza pedals, for example, and running them through this without some pretty heavy modification work. And then down below that, you'll see the little USB-C connection for connecting back to your PC. Now they tell me that you do want to use a USB 3 connection on your motherboard, unlike the previous models which have been able to get by with USB 2. On most new motherboards these days, most of the ports are USB 3, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue for too many people. But if you are looking at running this on an older PC, maybe if you're running iRacing, for example, exclusively, just make sure that you do have USB 3 available on your system. You might need to buy a PCI upgrade card or something like that. But the cable that they give you with these bases is very nice and high quality, nice and long as well, so that's not going to cause you any dramas. It is a nice braided cable too. You can see a little ferrite choke on either side as well to reduce any electromagnetic interference, and the plug is a USB-C connection which plugs in like so. Now another little observation here, which is simply based on a lot of the customer service inquiries that I see through Facebook, for example, people complaining about issues that they've had. One thing that I think they could have improved, and if you have a look at the GT DD Pro, if I chuck that up on top here, just to look at by comparison here, you can see it's actually exactly the same design here. So what's happened for a lot of people, and when I say a lot, I mean, you've got to consider how many people buy these products versus how many people have issues. So it's not something that's happening to everybody by any means. But what I've seen happen quite a lot is somebody will step on a cable and tear the USB connection off the main board, or tear these connections right out of the back as well. Now, I feel like there's a bit of a missed opportunity here where they could have added some sort of a reinforcement in the plastic housing behind these connections to add just a little bit of reinforcement, so if the cable does get stepped on, it's going to be the cable that tears out of the connector and potentially snaps the cable rather than tearing the connector directly off the board. So, I mean, I guess in fairness, it's just as likely that you would damage the connector anyway, pulling the cable out like that. So it's probably going to have to go back and be repaired anyway. But what we see quite frequently is the pads on the PCB itself or printed circuit board getting torn directly off, and that's a lot more difficult to repair than just a damaged connector, which can just be desoldered and replaced. So not sure why they didn't take that opportunity to improve it, although it does look very similar. Once again, if we bring this other guy over here, you can see there are some subtle differences. We don't have CAN bus on this guy, for example. The power connections are in a slightly different place, USB connections in a slightly different place too. So it is a separate mold. Not sure why they didn't take the opportunity to make that small little adjustment there that could have potentially saved them a lot of customer service heartache. So one little observation there too, but that is all the ins and outs and connections that you'll find on the back of both of these bases. So before we pop these covers off and have a look at what's actually inside, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the characteristics of the motor itself. So unlike with the DD1 and DD2, which use an outrunner style motor, and you can actually see a full teardown of a DD2 right here on this channel. I'll link it down in the description below for you guys if you're interested. But unlike an outrunner style motor, this is using a standard servo type electric motor, which has a couple of advantages over that outrunner style motor. It's a little bit more simple in its construction. For one, it's able to maintain high torque levels at high rotational speeds as well, which is of course going to be very important in the context of sim racing. And the design of the unit overall is a little bit more simple than what we had with the DD1 and DD2, which keeps the cost of production down a little bit whilst giving us a step forward in terms of the overall experience of using it. Now, that's the first time I've mentioned that the experience with using these guys is better than it is with the DD1 and DD2. I'll explain all the reasons why that is in terms of the actual driving experience a little bit later on today. But it is a better driving experience in terms of the responsiveness and detail that you get through both of these bases compared to not only the CSL DD and GTDD Pro, but also the DD1 and DD2, which I'm sure will surprise some people. But given that the DD1 and DD2 is pretty old technology now, for almost 5 years old, I believe, it's not surprising to me at least that these are that little bit better in terms of the overall driving experience. So there's a couple of key things that they've called out in the design of both of these motors. They've called out the fact that they're advertising them as continuous torque rather than peak torque, and they've made a big point of the fact that they're able to maintain that holding torque for long periods of time. So you're not going to see any drop off in performance if you're doing long sweeping corners, say if you're oval racing, for example, and you're holding large amounts of torque for long periods of time. Rally driving, where you're really kind of manhandling the car, for example, or just general endurance racing. A lot of people have found with some other brands that they have experienced a little bit of drop off in performance. You quite often see in Facebook groups and whatnot, people saying, hey, my force feedback just doesn't feel as strong after a couple of minutes or a couple of hours of usage. We've actually seen that specifically complained about quite commonly with the Moza R9, for example. Now, we've had two Moza R9 bases come through here at Boosted Media now, and I've never actually experienced the problem for myself, admittedly, but certainly didn't experience anything that gave any indication that force feedback was dropping off with these bases over time. Now, one interesting observation that I did have, and I did test this specifically as well, was I did some rally driving in the new WRC game from EA Sports for about an hour and a half with both of these bases. And in both cases, I tested the temperature of the casing here on the metal surface, this heatsink material, both inside and outside the ridges, and tested it to be about 2 degrees Celsius hotter than ambient temperature. So you'll see in the footage here, I measured the temperature on the casing itself, then I moved across to another part of the rig, which wasn't conducting any heat from anywhere else. It was only about a 2-degree difference at peak. So regardless of what I threw at these, that was running maximum torque levels as well on both bases. So it does appear that whatever they've done here does do the job, and I don't expect to see anybody having issues with any sort of thermal management whatsoever, which is a really good thing. It obviously means there's less stress on the motor as well, which means it should last that little bit longer. People get a little bit carried away with temperatures sometimes, thinking that colder is better. And while technically it is, as long as something's operating within its design specification and its tolerances, heat isn't generally a problem. But it is a good thing to see that in practice, both of these guys are operating well within their manufacturing tolerances. Now, the other motor characteristic that they've made a big deal about in their marketing is the slew rate, which is a measure of the motor's overall responsiveness, how quickly it can change direction, ramp up speed, and those important things. Now, again, you can imagine how important that is to sim racing and what kind of an impact it has on the overall driving experience. This was a spec that was largely kind of overlooked. People were kind of focused primarily on just peak strength for a very long time now. And then a couple of brands, notably FANATEC'S SimSports, for example, made a really big deal about it in their marketing, and now we're seeing other brands kind of follow suit here as well. Now, interestingly, FANATEC haven't actually put a number on these products. They included a little chart on their website, which I'll put up on the screen for you guys now, which shows a couple of wavy lines representing the DD Plus and DD. You can see the responsiveness of the DD Plus is a little bit higher than what it is on the DD, which we'll unpack later on when we get into the driving experience. But you'll see there's a bunch of random wavy lines that are representing supposedly other manufacturers. And now they've said the reason why they haven't put a number on it specifically is because their testing methodology might not be exactly the same as other brands, and quite frankly, they don't want to on other brands, basically. So unfortunately, there isn't really a standardized testing methodology that we can apply to, you know, verify their claims of the best. But what I can tell you is that in the driving experience, it is definitely a characteristic that is noticeable over some other brands, some more so than others, but definitely right up there with the best of the best when it comes to responsiveness. So I'd say that their claims are probably at least valid. Whether or not it is in fact the fastest number, who knows, but it doesn't really matter as long as the driving experience is good, right? But that ability to produce very, very granular detail becomes even more important when we get into effects like FullForce, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. But what I want to do now is pop the back cover off both of these guys, as well as my GT DD Pro. I know one of the big questions that you guys have, and one of the big disappointments that you guys had, was when they announced that FullForce wouldn't be available on their older products, so the DD1, DD2, CSL DD, and GT DD Pro. Now, they've said that it is for technical reasons, which to me says that the hardware of those older models simply isn't fast enough to be able to process those signals. Now, I touched on before the fact that these do require USB 3 as opposed to the other products which we'll get by on USB 2. So that might be a clue there. But what I want to do is have a look at the motherboards on all of these guys and see whether we can see any differences there that might give us some clues, as well as just analyzing the general build quality. So let's pop the covers off all of these guys now and take a bit of a sticky beat. Okay, so what we have in front of us here is the DD Plus with the back cover off, the DD with the back cover off, GT DD Pro, and a salvaged motherboard from my DD2, which we used for the teardown video, which those who've been following us for a while will remember our DD2 fell off the shelf and died. So that's what we've got here in front of us. A couple of things that I want to point out here. Firstly, you'll notice that the differences between the DD Plus and DD are extremely subtle here. At a glance, you won't see any difference between the two whatsoever. And they're even running the exact same processor, as I'll show you in just a minute. But when I got up on this and had a really close look, there are actually some differences in the components between the two of them, between the power phases. So you've got 3 separate phases here for power delivery, one there, and one there. And the values on some of these components are slightly different between the DD Plus and the DD. Now, I'm not going to drill into it in more detail than that, remembering again that our DD Plus is an early run of production, so that may account for some of the differences there. Once we got our hands on a mass production unit, I'll drill into this in more detail in our comparison video, and we can look into the actual differences between those components, what the values are and whatnot. But subtle differences between the two, but it does make sense what they were saying with different electronics between the DD Plus and the DD. So in terms of the actual layout and design here, you probably already noticed very similar, in fact, to what we have with the GT DD Pro. Obviously, they're trying to carry as much across as they can just to keep the costs of development down, which obviously makes sense. Let's just set this guy aside for a moment here. I'm also going to set this guy aside too, and I just want to get in a little bit more closely here and show you a few little details. So this is basically the brains of the operation here. This is the motherboard, which has, as we said before, all the power delivery circuitry here for each of our 3 phases, all of our inputs and outputs down the bottom here, as well as USB interface. You can see a little plug connector through to the front here for the power button. There's another little power connection in the side here too. And then if you have a look around the top here, if I roll it over for you guys quickly, you'll notice that there's these little spade connectors here for the 3 phases of power that actually go through to the motor. So this is quite clever the way it's all bolted together, minimizes the amount of cabling and things like that that are necessary in the design. Again, very similar to what we saw with the GT DD Pro and CSL DD. So each of those 3 phases delivers its power directly to the peg on the motor assembly. And then if we have a look in the back there as well, I'm not going to remove this assembly from the back of the motor. We may do that in our final comparison videos a little bit later on, but you'll notice there's this assembly just here as well. I'm not sure if that's got something to do with data transmission. I know they have moved across to a slip ring design for delivering power and data to the motor stem whilst maintaining the ability to rotate infinitely, as opposed to what we saw on the DD1 and DD2. Now, they haven't told me how many cycles they've tested this slip ring to, but obviously it will have some sort of a limitation. There will come a point where it does wear out, whereas an optical system like what we see in the DD1, DD2 and inductive coupling system for power is theoretically at least more durable than what we have here. So we can see some of the areas where they've cut costs and, you know, obviously managed to keep the price down a little bit from what the DD1, DD2 were initially, at least, compared to what we have here. But in doing so, not reduce the quality of the force feedback, and in actual fact, increase the quality of the force feedback. So those are some of the differences in the mechanical design between the two. Now, if we get in on the side just here, you guys aren't going to be able to see it, but I'll include some photos for you. Just in there is our little processor, which is the brains of the operation. It is the exact same processor on both the DD Plus and the DD, and it is significantly different to what we find on the GT DD Pro and the CSL DD, as well as the DD1 and DD2. So I'll let you guys do your own research there in terms of what processors are capable of what and what not. But it does all stack up that you know, this is a completely different processor family to what we've seen previously. So therefore, could explain the reason why we're not seeing that FullForce technology used on the older models. So again, that's something that we'll unpack in more detail when we get into our final videos on all of these guys, but just wanted to highlight those things for you. So again, let me know in the comments if you do have any further questions on what you're seeing internally on both of these guys, and I'm happy to do my best to answer those for you. They haven't put any limitations on what we can and can't show here. I'm just sort of trying to be sensible about it, keeping in mind that what we have here with the DD Plus may in fact change between production and what we have on the desk here now. Now again, you're not going to be able to see this super clearly on camera, but I will show you some photos as we describe this. Up on the top right hand side of the processor on the DD Plus, you'll notice that there's a little tiny chip. If you switch over to the DD non-Plus, you'll notice that there's an area of the PCB that's unpopulated. I believe that is the security chip for PlayStation compatibility. And my understanding is they have to actually purchase those chips physically from Sony themselves and then have them populated onto the board. So that is the difference there in terms of hardware for those who might be wondering. But look, in terms of quality and everything, I don't see any major concerns whatsoever. You know, all the cables are decent gauges. There's no pinched cables. We've got rubber grommets where there's any pass-throughs on the PCB. Good high quality soldering throughout as well. They've obviously tried to minimize the amount of material use in the design, which is good. And yeah, absolutely no cause for concern here at all from what I can see. Now, Lawrence de Sosa, everybody's favorite reviewer, also sent me across some photos, which he took for me specifically at the ADAC conference, which shows the exploded view of the entire unit. We're not going to pull the entire thing apart for you guys now because I don't think it's really going to achieve too much. But for those who are interested in seeing more detail, jump on our website down via the link in the description below, and we'll share those photos that Lawrence very kindly took for me on our written article pertaining to these two bases. But let's get the clothes back on now. And yeah, I think we are ready to head over to the rig now and talk about driving experience. We're not going to touch on software and interface in today's video, simply because we are still running early software and they tell me the UI will be changing in the final production. So we'll cover that in the final video too. But I will be touching on the wider ecosystem, how things work and all that important information as we get into our driving experience and conclusions. Okay, so all set up and ready to go on the sim rig now with the CSDD. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I've actually been pretty sick for the past week and a half now, and that's actually given me a really awesome opportunity to go back through, put pretty much every single competitor wheelbase back on the rig, as well as some more expensive and cheaper ones as well, just to kind of go back through, test everything again with the latest firmware, software, drivers, and re-establish a good baseline, get everything nice and fresh in my memory for giving you my impressions of the CSDD and the CSDD Plus. So all of that really important driving experience stuff is what we're going to be running through for the remainder of today's video. But there are a couple of things that I just wanted to quickly explain in a little bit more detail before we get into the actual driving. So firstly, let's chuck on our M4 GT3 wheel. Now I've chosen this wheel specifically. We'll be testing with a variety of different wheels in today's video, but to start with here, I'm using their most solid, most rigid wheel. And we do of course have a full review of this wheel if you're interested in checking out all the details right here on this very channel, or just Google M4 GT3 boosted media review and you'll find it as well. So chuck the wheel on there. As you can see, very, very easy to install on the QR2. If you're interested in more detail on the QR2 as well, we do have a very detailed video taking you through all the intricacies of that new ecosystem as well. But just for the purpose of this video, what I'm interested in is that there is absolutely no discernible flex there whatsoever in the shaft of the motor itself or in the quick release, as we've discussed previously in our QR2 videos, but I'm not perceiving any flex there whatsoever. I don't know what you guys can see on camera. Tom just told me that on his preview monitor, he's actually seeing a tiny little bit of movement just in the collar relative to the face of the base there, but yeah, I can tell you that I'm certainly not perceiving anything at all through my hand. So that is all good. So that gives us a good launch pad into talking about this new FullForce force feedback technology that Fanatec have released along with these two new wheelbases. So what this is doing is adding an additional layer of more granular force feedback detail on top of the already existing direct input force feedback effects, which are used pretty much universally these days and have been for a very, very long time now, decades in fact. So you've got your standard direct input based force feedback effects, and then you've got this extra layer over the top, which is what they're calling FullForce. Now it works in a very similar way to Logitech's TrueForce technology, and we will be making some comparisons against that a little bit later on in today's video too. So definitely stick around for that. But at this point in time, it's important that you guys are aware that it is reliant on game integration. So there's an API, or application programming interface. So they provide that API to game developers, and the game developers are able to actually integrate that into their game at the game level. So it's not like a plugin that runs over the top or anything like that. It's actually running at the game level, and that keeps things like latencies to an absolute minimum, as opposed to taking a signal and then modifying that signal later on. So at the point in time that we're filming this, none of the sim racing titles actually have that integration just yet. So that's something that we'll definitely be coming back and testing more thoroughly later on. But Fanatec have provided us with the exact same demonstration that they ran at the ADAC conference just recently. What they've got is a Python script which is running and actually using iRacing's audio-based telemetry output to generate the effects, loop them back in and run through the wheelbase. And of course, this is something that we'll loop back and test more thoroughly for you guys once it is integrated into a couple of games. But for now, they tell me that it does feel very, very close. It is representative in their words. But unfortunately, for now, at least, we will have to take their word for it. I mean, I can only imagine that it's going to get better from this point onwards, because what we're doing at the moment does introduce latency and, you know, weird artifacts and things like that. But I do just need to let you guys know that what we're testing here isn't necessarily 100% representative of the final product. So obviously just be aware of that. Now, because of the way this works, and I want to stress that this isn't something that you guys are going to be able to do at home, but because they provided us with this test Python script, what it means is we're actually able to loop any audio signal back into the base and use it as a force feedback effect. So I thought it'd be really interesting to actually run some music and see what actually happens when you run music through the wheelbase, whether you get the full frequency range or response, or whether you only hear a very low frequency, or what's going to happen here. So let's just quickly click play on some music now for you guys, and we'll see exactly what happens. Going to get the gain level turned up. So there's the F1 theme for you, and you can hear there what I'm listening for here is the frequency response range. So you're not obviously getting any really significant bass or anything like that out of it, but you are getting quite a high frequency response there, which does translate through the wheel as, you know, quite high level of, I mean, I'm not going to call it detail here because it is just noise that's coming through, but as you can hear, the bass is actually able to respond to those higher frequencies. So why don't we actually run a frequency sweep through the bass now and see exactly what its frequency response range is like. So up on the screen now, you'll see Adobe Audition. What we've got is a little tone generator, I guess you could call it, VST plugin here. So I'm going to hit play. We're going to start off at 0.01 hertz here, and we're going to just wind this up slowly. And you can see now the wheel's starting to shake a little bit at 5 hertz. And then we have response all the way through. You can hear it's starting to taper off at about 1.8 kilohertz, and then completely gone by about 2.1 kilohertz. So inside iRacing now, just quickly before we hit the track, I want to explain exactly how this demonstration of what FullForce should feel like once it's implemented is working. So in iRacing's MISC menu, you've got this LFE enable button. What that does is it allows it to send telemetry-based data out through an audio output in the game for driving things like butt kickers, transducers, things like that, basically. So what it does is, rather than just sending the raw game audio as if you're plugging into a headphone jack, what it's allowing us to do is actually break down various different elements of the telemetry data into individual signals, which we can adjust the gain levels of to get the right balance and get the thing to feel how we like. So I'm not sure 100% whether we're going to have the same parameters available once the actual game API integration is done. I don't know whether we're going to have sliders to be able to individually tweak things. I know with TrueForce at the moment, you actually have to go into the INI files and actually tweak the levels yourself. So you only have an enable or disable button for TrueForce, which was something that I was hoping we would see flesh out a little bit more in the last year and a bit since TrueForce. Actually, it's been longer than that now, hasn't it? Because it was the G923 that had TrueForce, not just the G Pro. But here we are anyway. So can't tell you exactly what FullForce's integration will actually look like in iRacing, but for now, these are the parameters that we're working with here. So it's important to understand that we do actually have individual control, and we can fine tune and tweak things to get them feeling good for this particular test. These are the default settings that they actually sent me to use here. I did find it interesting that they had that road texture set to -40 and the engine noise turned up here, because you don't generally tend to feel engine vibration through the steering wheel so much as you do road textures. But we'll do a little bit of experimenting with that while we're driving as well. I'll test both of those on and off and give you a sense of what that feels like. But yeah, just wanted to show you this so that A, you would get an understanding of how this is working and understand that it's not just the raw audio signal that is coming through the base. It is, you know, telemetry based. And B, just to explain to you that even though we have this in this particular demonstration, it may not necessarily be in the final integration of FullForce when that gets integrated into the game. So let's click OK on that now, and let's jump out onto the track and talk about what this thing actually feels like. So loaded into the game now. Again, this is the DD, not the DD Plus. We'll switch over to the DD Plus in just a minute and give our impressions of that as well. But the first thing that I always like to do when I'm testing out any wheelbase here, and I have already run all these tests, but I'm going to take you through the process again just so that you guys can get my impressions. I always like to just rotate the wheel around, feel the weight of the car as the wheels kind of lift up the chassis on either side. So as we rotate the wheel, it's got a really nice, smooth feeling. I would say on initial rotation, it is as smooth as any other wheelbase out there on the market. It doesn't have any sort of sensation of torque rippling or cogging or any sort of graininess to it at all. It doesn't feel notchy. You don't feel that transition across between the different magnets that you feel a little bit in the DD1 and DD2, and also a tiny little bit in the CSL DD and GT DD Pro. So already it does feel better there. One thing that I did notice, and I didn't notice it immediately, but in my testing, it was something that did jump out at me, just compared to some of the other options on the market. If you rotate the wheel very quickly, so again, this is only something you notice when you're just kind of sitting stationary like this. When you're driving, it kind of just pales into oblivion. But when you rotate the wheel very, very quickly, there is a little bit of a sensation of a tiny bit of, not notchiness, but a little bit of graininess to it. So I did spend a number of hours experimenting with this to try and sort of figure out what exactly was causing it. And it does seem to be related to the natural damper filter inside the drivers that we're running for this particular test. So when I wind the damper down to about 20% or less, it kind of disappears. Anything above about maybe 30%, you start to notice it more and more and more. Up at around 50%, it does become quite noticeable. So just be aware of that. But again, it may just be related to the drive. This is something we'll definitely retest when we get our hands on full release drivers a little bit later on. So let's head out on track now. The other thing just to be aware of as well is that I'm not running any FullForce just yet, because I know that it's probably not going to quite yet be integrated at the time that at least the people that pre-ordered this and will have earlier access to it are receiving them in the next couple of weeks. Probably not going to have FullForce just yet. I know that iRacing is going to be one of the first to receive it, but I want to test this out without FullForce, give you the impression there, and then we'll wind a little bit of FullForce in and tell you what that's like. You can see my skid marks there from some earlier testing. Bit of a little accident there. The other thing to be aware of as well is that we are running the full 12 Newton meters of dynamic range available for the CS DD. We'll be switching across to the DD Plus and experimenting with what increasing that to the 15 Newton meter mark gives us in terms of improvement. Remembering again that the DD Plus does give you that PlayStation compatibility, but it is also a little bit more expensive as well. So whether or not that's worth it in terms of force feedback, strength and fidelity is something that we'll be checking out too. So immediately here, and this isn't first impressions because I have already spent a lot of time driving with this, but I wanted to really kind of wrap my head around all the little nuances, do a bunch of testing with other bases, and then come back to this and record this just so you got a better overall impression of some of the observations that I have. So I've probably got about 10 hours of usage, I would say, by now on both this and the DD Plus, cumulatively at least. And the thing that I noticed straight away is that at the maximum setting of 12 Newton meters, this does feel more powerful than a lot of the other competitors do with their advertised 12 or so Newton meters of torque. Now that makes sense when you consider that most of them are advertising peak strength rather than their holding torque. I did run the Moza R12 and the R16 directly before filming this part, and I would say that this probably feels closer to the 16 than it does to the 12, which kind of makes sense. But I do think that this is going to be powerful enough for the vast majority of people. So, I mean, it's obviously going to depend on your experience and what you're used to driving with. I would say if you're coming from something like a Logitech G923 or G920, maybe something like a Moza R5 or even a CSL DD, and you feel like that is nowhere near strong enough for you, maybe you're concerned that the DD still might not be quite strong enough for you and you might be better off going to the 15 Newton meters. I would say chances are this is probably going to be enough for you. So if it's just strength, I mean, you guys have a better understanding of how strong you are than I do, but for me, this would probably be enough. I don't think that I'd be, going, oh, I wish I had more strength in this. There is a point, and it's going to be different for everybody, but there is a point where you transition between you driving the car and the car driving you. And if the force feedback's too strong, you cross that line, and anything beyond that is just kind of pointless. So it's really important to be aware of that. But yeah, I'd say this is probably strong enough for the vast majority of people, and definitely a noticeable step up in terms of strength, more than noticeable. It's a different experience compared to something like the GTDD Pro or CSL DD at the 8 Newton meter with the boost pack mark, and obviously completely different to the standard 5 Newton meter experience. But in terms of the actual detail in the force spec, remembering again that we're not running the FullForce demonstration on top of this just yet, the force feedback itself is very, very, very detailed and sharp. That's probably the next thing that jumps out at me, is things like when we bump up over the ripple strips, and even if I hit this little sausage curb there a little bit intentionally, I do feel not necessarily more detail, but more detailed detail, I think. That's a funny way of explaining it. Let me try and articulate that a little bit better. iRacing has a few areas where it lacks in detail in general, so road texture being one of them. So in areas where there is detail present in the game, this base is doing a noticeably outstanding job of conveying that detail. So if I dip a wheel onto the grass, for example, you do immediately feel that texture and you do feel that rollover. If I put a wheel up onto the curb here as well, you do get that sensation of running up on the curb. You get the sensation, of course, of the weight transfer in the car as well, which is something that pretty much everybody within this segment's got nailed these days. Those general force feedback effects are very good on everything, really. But where this is shining to me is more in that more granular, sharper detail that really gives you a good sensation of when you're running up against the track limits, when you dip a wheel on the grass. Little things like that are just that little bit sharper. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit now and just sort of drive the car a little bit more on the edge. Just wanted to sort of get the back end twitching a little bit there as well. And you could see immediately, as soon as I started to lose the back end, and I did that intentionally, I was able to sort of jerk the steering. I felt the sensation of the car rotating through the steering, but it didn't get away from me. It never felt like the rotation of the car actually overtook the force feedback. And that's an issue that you'll have on more entry-level force feedback wheels, is that they're all fine and well and good as long as nothing's going wrong. But the moment you lose the car, they can't respond quick enough for you to catch it again, because the rotation that you're feeling through the steering isn't actually in sync with what's going on with the car itself. Whereas there, and again, able to sort of, I mean, I couldn't catch that one because I was on the brake still and sliding, but definitely the rotation of the car, the steering rotated very, very quickly with it. So let's do a bit of a faster lap now, and then we'll start to wind in a little bit of full force and talk about that. So we'll go hammering through Eau Rouge as quick as we can. First through La Source, get it turned in. A little bit of wheel spin there on the exit, but again, very communicative. Let's go through here. Hopefully my tires aren't still overheated. Little tiny tap on the wall there, that's okay. You can see just those little bumps up coming through those ripples there. All very smooth. And look, the road detail for what it is in iRacing, remembering its limitations, is very good. Definitely feels that little bit sharper than what I'm used to with some of the other bases that I've been testing. Definitely cooked my rear tires there a little bit in that spin, but that's okay. Just those little mid-corner details as well. It's not overpowering me. It's not jerking me around to the point where I'm going to lose the car, but a lot of detail there. It's not an absolute game changer, but it is very, very, very good. It is up there with the best of the best in terms of force feedback detailing, classes that are above this as well. So if you're comparing with other bases around this kind of price point, very, very, very good. But again, everything is pretty good these days. So, you know, I don't want you guys to get the impression that you guys should just run out and sell everything you got to buy this. That's absolutely not the case, but it is very, very, very good. So let's dial in a little bit of full force now as well. I'll go into the tuning menu. Try not to crash here with my eyes off the road. Okay, so full force. So I'm going to wind it on now. Just a little bit. This is about 10%. Now I remember from testing True Force, I ended up running it around about sort of 20% on the Logitech. Anything more than that and just kind of muddied the force feedback overall. It was taking away from the experience rather than adding to it. I'm running it at 15% now. And it's just giving me that little bit of extra detail there. Now remember, I'm running there the settings that they suggested, which was a little bit of engine vibration, but no road texture at the moment. So it does definitely give me the sensation of a little bit more communication in the wheel, a little bit more connected to the car. I'm going to increase it a little bit more to 20% now. And let's just feel how things feel through these next sequence of corners. A little bit more. Yeah, a little bit more connected to the car. A little bit more immersive. But certainly it's not, and I didn't expect it to, but it's certainly not adding anything that's going to make me faster, because it's not communicating details in, you know, the rotation of the car, the steering, the suspension, the tire surfaces, those kinds of effects. That's not really what it's intended to do. So no surprises there, but I'm just going to wind it up a little bit more now to 30%. And I'm not going to over-analyze this, because remembering again, it is an early demo, and you know, things may change significantly here. But now at this 30% mark, it is starting to cross that threshold into just kind of creating noise and overwhelming my senses to the point where I'm not getting such a good sense of what the car's doing underneath me. So it's definitely something where I'd say less is more. I'm actually going to stop now, and I'm going to swap over, add in the road texture rather than the engine vibration, because I feel like engine vibration, you know, most modern cars these days, you don't really feel a lot of that through the steering anyway. So let's quickly make that change and we'll come back. All right, so we have road texture dialed in now instead of engine vibration. Let's see whether that makes any difference. I'll wind full force up a little bit higher. It definitely feels different now. Yeah, that to me isn't necessarily better, but it's more communicative. It feels like the car's telling me what it's doing more than it did when it was just engine vibration. So I'm running that around sort of 40% now. And again, remembering that iRacing isn't the greatest when it comes to road detail anyway, but unfortunately it is the only title that we can demonstrate this with at the moment because of that LFE output. Unfortunately, we can't test it with the likes of ACC and so forth, but it does perhaps feel a little bit more robotic than the engine vibration did, which again may well be just down to the nature of this demonstration. So I don't want to overanalyze this. I think the key takeaway here is that what you should expect from FullForce is that it's going to be adding additional immersion. It's going to be kind of just really giving you that more granular, that more finite detail in terms of things like textures, rather than something that's going to be revolutionizing force feedback at a fundamental level and giving you more sensation of what the car's doing underneath you, if that makes sense. But definitely something that we'll revisit once FullForce is available in its full form at API level. Let's switch over between the DD and the DD Plus now and see what that extra 3 Newton meters of holding torque does for the experience. Now, firstly, all the impressions with things like motor characteristics, steering, all those things, like we talked about with the DD before, exactly the same with the DD Plus, so we don't need to run all through that again. What I'm looking for here is what this brings to the table in terms of 2 things, the additional strength, but also whether there's an additional sharpness, remembering again that the slew rate is a little bit higher with this base at 15 Newton meters than what the DD is at 12 Newton meters. So we'll comment on that, whether there's anything perceivable at least in the driving experience as well. So 15 Newton meters of continuous torque here. Otherwise, all of my other force feedback settings are set exactly the same way as they were on the DD. So we'll see exactly what those differences are. I'm running the exact same driver package between both of these bases as well, for those who might be wondering. So it is still an early version of the drivers, and we will of course revisit all of that once final drivers are out, and we'll do our full reviews of both of these bases as a standalone video to take you through anything else. But definitely feels more than a little bit stronger. It's not overpoweringly strong. It's not so strong that it's manhandling me. I would say it's still, for me at least, under that threshold of where it just becomes so powerful that the car's driving you rather than you driving the car. But I would say that for me, the additional strength probably isn't necessary driving a car like this, at least. And I have done a bunch of testing in a whole bunch of different sims, which we'll go through in just a minute in my extended driving experience reflections and conclusions. But just as a sort of initial impression here to run you through, I'm not noticing that the force feedback is sharper than it was with the DD. If you were to measure it, maybe, but it's certainly, I mean, what's important, what you guys need to know is whether it's a game-changing thing, whether there's a reason other than that PlayStation compatibility to buy this over the other model. And for me, at my strength level, with the type of cars that I drive, probably not, is my answer at the moment. I'm not noticing anything significantly improved in the quality of the force feedback the sharpness, the sensation, it all feels characteristically the same as it does on the DD, which I expected. I just wasn't sure whether that slight bump up in slew rate, and again, they haven't published the numbers on this, but if you look at their charts, it does state that the slew rate is a little bit more responsive, or the wheelbase is a little bit more responsive at that 15 Newton meter mark. So yeah, I think if you know that you're going to need that extra 3 Newton meters, you're, got a lot of upper body strength, you smash yourself at the gym every day, then maybe it's worth it to you. But for me, I've got to admit that if I only had the DD, I would be perfectly satisfied with it, and I wouldn't, having used this, I personally don't need the extra strength, and I'm not really noticing any significant game-changing difference in the quality to force feedback, which is already outstandingly good on the DD non-plus model. So we will again revisit this and unpack it further once we've got our hands on final drivers and firmware and all those things. Be interesting to see what FullForce might have in terms of influence on this as well. But with what we have in front of us today to experiment with, and having done all that back-to-back testing, I'm satisfied with the DD. DD Plus is a nice to have, but not necessary, and obviously unless you need that PlayStation compatibility. So let's dive into a little bit more detail now in terms of driving at weaker force feedback levels as well, see how that compares across to CSL DD, GT DD Pro and whatnot, and then we'll unpack the full driving experience comparisons with competitor brands and all that information, and wrap things up with our final conclusions. Okay, so extended driving impressions now, and I spent many hours with both of these wheelbases testing across the full spectrum, all the way from more arcade style through to full-on simulation like iRacing, which we already spoke about a little bit. I also did do a bunch of testing on PS5 as well, and I'll set a separate chapter down below for you guys that are interested in the initial impressions there as well, because I know that's something that's very important to some of you guys. So I'll start off here by talking about the experience with these guys through a wider spectrum of different types of sim racing titles, and then we'll relate that back to the experience with some of the competitor products to give you a better understanding of where this sits in the market relative to the performance of others. So let's start off by talking about the transition between dirt and asphalt surfaces in iRacing, where we do have that FullForce simulation, at least at this point. Now, again, this may change with the full integration of FullForce. I'm hoping that it does, because one of the things that I was really hoping that these bases might do is bring out a little bit more detail in the transition between asphalt and dirt surfaces. Unfortunately, that still isn't the case. It does appear to be just something that's lacking in iRacing in general. I thought there might be some magic sauce with these guys that would fix that problem, but unfortunately there isn't. There is still just a lack of feeling there. You do obviously get a sensation of the car's grip level changing, all those important details, but you just don't feel the difference in texture underneath the wheels like I was hoping might be the case. That is also carried across into, I did test with Dirt Rally 2 and the new EA Sports WRC, and there is more profound detail in some of those textures in those titles, obviously being more rally focused, but there's nothing revolutionary there that completely changes the game with regards to those things. So I thought that was important to mention here off the bat, simply because I know a lot of people were hoping that this would be bringing out all these new things that you'd never felt before. And at least at this point in time, that isn't the case. However, I am hopeful that we see some sort of a revolution in force feedback. I feel like we're a bit at a stalemate at this point in time, where the hardware has gotten so good that we really need something revolutionary to happen in terms of how force feedback is actually generated. Remembering that direct input is now a 20, almost 30-year-old technology, and it's great to see these new APIs like TrueForce from Logitech and FullForce now from Fanatec coming to fruition, and I'm really excited to see what can be done with that, as we demonstrated in the earlier demos with generating tones and running even music through these bases. It gives you an understanding of what's possible into the future, but at this point in time, at least without the game integration, we can't really comment on that too much further. But I think there is a lot of potential there that at this point in time that we're filming this is potentially a little bit unrealized. But I don't want you guys to buy these products thinking that they're going to absolutely revolutionize the force feedback experience, because at least out of the box as it stands right now, they certainly don't do that. But what they do is, as I described with relation to iRacing, this was pretty much unanimous across the board of everything that I tested. Force feedback details do feel sharper and more precise in general. Obviously you have the added strength with these guys as well compared to what you're obviously used to using, but across the board there, strength aside, definitely do feel a stronger, sharper detail in general. I wouldn't say that it is something that's generally going to make you faster and more consistent. I did comment before about the ability to catch that snap oversteer, sudden understeer, things that you may not be able to catch with some other wheelbases that are on the slower side. So if you're comparing to something like a belt-driven wheelbase or a cog-driven, something like that, then that is definitely something that you'll notice. But those are characteristics that you're going to notice on pretty much any quality direct drive wheelbase these days. So it's not necessarily a reason to go for these guys specifically, but certainly something that you can expect to get out of the experience compared to some of the older technology that's out there. So one of the other things that I always look for in wheelbases as well is consistency across sim racing titles. We've seen not so much these days, but in days gone by, often you'd load up a game, you'd get it dialed in, you get it feeling absolutely fantastic, and you'd really struggle to replicate that same feeling, even if you're driving the same car and track combination in a different title. So say you've gone from iRacing to ACC, it might feel completely different. One of the things I noticed with a lot of brands early on is that ACC, for example, felt a lot more rubber bandy than iRacing did for a lot of wheelbases. That was never really the case with Fanatec though. So I'm happy to say good consistency across the board here. Obviously there will be nuances depending on the sim title that you're driving. That's unavoidable on any brand. But in terms of having a relatively consistent experience across the board, very much one of the things that has always been outstanding within the Fanatec ecosystem, and certainly also the case with these guys. So that was definitely worth highlighting. Likewise as well in terms of the user experience, very seamless, even though we are running early software at this point in time. Didn't have any issues with any of the titles that we threw at it. Everything just worked straight out of the box with no issues whatsoever. And even just as far as many of the games that we tried, like ACC for example, actually loaded up profiles for the wheels that we had connected, and you literally just loaded the game, jumped straight on the track and were able to drive. Obviously you can still customize things if you want to, but that's just one of the strengths when it comes to the Fanatec ecosystem compared to a lot of other competitor brands. Not so much Logitech and Thrustmaster, those are pretty good, but pretty much everybody else doesn't quite have that same level of game integration that we see here with the Fanatec ecosystem. Another strength as well that definitely does need to be highlighted is just that ability to make adjustments to the force feedback directly through the tuning menu on the Fanatec steering wheels. That's something that has always been a pretty major strength within the Fanatec ecosystem. A lot of other brands now have started to catch up with their own ways of doing things. In particular, a lot of brands now have mobile apps that you can use, so you can just bring up your phone and make adjustments on your phone to force feedback settings. You can do that with Fanatec now as well, but just having that convenience of being able to make adjustments on the wheel itself. I mean, you even saw when I was testing out before, I was able to wind in and out full force from the wheel itself while I was driving. And you know, just having the ability to do little tweaks and things like that is something that is very convenient. And even just the ability to switch between individual profiles of different cars or sims directly from the wheel is really powerful as well. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to start a race on my Simucube 2 Ultimate on my daily driver rig and found that I've got the wrong profile loaded and I just don't have time to Alt-Tab out and change over to the correct profile. In the Fanatec ecosystem, you literally just go tuning menu, tab up or tab down through your 5 selectable profiles, and you're good to go every single time. So, you know, just little things like that I think do make a difference. And, you know, a lot of people focus very heavily on just the quality of the force feedback, just the strength. And there are so many other aspects to having a good experience overall that I think these little things are worth mentioning. We've got reviews of all the various different brands here on Boosted Media, so you can dive into each one of those and see what the user experience is like to get a good understanding of what might suit you best. But it's something that's always been quite strong within the Fanatec ecosystem. So again, just something that's worth highlighting. So let's talk about the experience on consoles now, and then we'll move into some more direct comparisons between brands. So look, I mean, the experience on consoles, we've tested this out quite a bit over the years, on and off with various different brands, on various different types of consoles as well. I tested across Xbox Series X and PS5. And look, I mean, the observations that I've had previously with other brands and with other Fanatec products pretty much apply here as well. We don't have FullForce working in any PlayStation 5 title just yet, and I think that is definitely something that we need to kind of wait for before we can comment on this too much, because I think that might be something that does revolutionize the experience on consoles more specifically. Definitely comparing this back to back with the experience using the Logitech G Pro, which has True Force, the force feedback does feel a lot more detailed on PlayStation 5 than it does with these guys at this point in time. But I'm sure that once FullForce is integrated on the PS5, then that gap will close up pretty much immediately. So at the moment, this point in time, the best I can really do for you guys on console is say, This does feel like a slightly more responsive, slightly stronger CSL DD or GT DD Pro. So if you feel like your GT DD Pro or CSL DD just isn't strong enough for you, even with the boost kit, and you're looking for more power, then yeah, absolutely, these are gonna give you what you want. But beyond that, I do want to wait and reserve final judgment until we have that FullForce integration, because I just think, given the lack of detail on consoles compared to PC inherently without FullForce, it is going to be much more of a important determining factor in what the overall experience is like. So we'll reserve judgment there until we have FullForce integrated in more titles. We'll come back and we might do a dedicated PS5 head-to-head video, maybe between the Logitech ecosystem and the Fanatec ecosystem, to see which one comes out on top. So in terms of comparisons with other brands now, and I do need to caveat this once again by saying that this is an early experience. We still don't have the final software available for these guys. So that may well change some of my thoughts and opinions in this section. But look, I mean, as I touched on earlier on in the video, the experience with pretty much everything is very, very good these days. And look, I mean, I did back-to-back testing pretty much for 4 days straight, testing various different bases, various different sim titles, you know, pretty much went across the board and retested absolutely everything. And there was nothing to me that really absolutely jumped out as being absolutely incredible and game-changing and, you know, oh my God, you have to buy this one over anything else within this kind of sector of the market. I think once you get up into, you know, your SimuCube 2 Pro, your Acertec Invicta, your SimuCube 2 Ultimate even, once you get up to that level, you start to notice a little bit more difference between those jumps in price. But at the level we're talking about here with DD and DD Plus, look, honestly, everything is pretty darn good. I could nitpick subtle little nuances between different brands, but I think really the only thing that really honestly jumped out to me in that experience in testing everything back to back is that pretty much everybody seems to be a little bit ahead of Mozza with the R9 and the R12 at the moment. One of the things that I've always commented on with their software is that it does require quite a bit more filtering at this point in time. So you do tend to lose a little bit of the detail that I think their hardware might be capable of achieving, simply because you're having to run a little bit more damping, a little bit more filtering in general, just to get rid of some of the robotic feeling, some of the weird glitches that you get sometimes. And yeah, so I do feel like on the software front, on the software side of things, Mozza are maybe lagging a little bit behind now. But look, in terms of pretty much everybody else, so we tested Acertec SimSports, we tested the VRS Direct Force Pro, we tested the Logitech G Pro, the Alpha Mini. You guys can see the wall of DD behind me here, SimuCube 2 Sport as well. Look, honestly, in a blind test, there's not a massive difference between any of these guys at these kinds of torque levels. If I had to call out one thing, I would say that both of these guys feel maybe just a touch more responsive than some of their competitors. But look, honestly guys, there's just so little in it these days and everything is just so darn good now that it really is nitpicking. And, you know, I think the point that I want you guys to take away from this video is that, you know, if you own any of the other bases that you see behind me, all of them are really good. All of them give you a really good experience. And I'm not suggesting for a second that anybody rush out and sell any one of those things to facilitate purchasing one of these, particularly at a loss. I think really where these things are outstanding, at least at this point in time, is just in the wider ecosystem. We've talked about the benefits of Fanatec till the cows come home in many videos previously, but I think now that they've fixed up the quick release with the new QR2, once you add all those elements together, it is a very, very, very strong offering from Fanatec that brings them right back up to the forefront of technology, brings them right back up to that top level, and is definitely something that is worth including in your considerations if you're looking at any of the bases that you see behind us here. Now, I know a lot of you guys are wondering how this compares directly against the Podium DD1 and DD2, given that the DD1 at the moment at least is a similar price point. Now, look, the overall experience that I've had with this early software does lend me to lean towards the CSDD and DD Plus as the better option over both the DD1 and the DD2, simply because I don't need the torque levels provided by the DD2 anyway, and there is just that little bit of additional sharpness in the quality of the force feedback, plus the fact that we don't have that torque ripple or cogging effect with the rotation of the wheel, which is something that has always annoyed me a little bit with the DD1 and DD2. So I would say that this is overall a better piece of hardware in terms of the driving experience. Build quality maybe isn't quite up to the same standard as the Podium bases, but we just don't know at this point what exactly FullForce is going to bring to the table, remembering again that DD1 and DD2 won't be compatible with that. So that may well be a reason to just hold off for now and wait before making a decision. If they do end up dropping the price even further on the DD1 though, definitely still worth considering. There isn't a massive difference. It's not a game-changing difference between any of these bases that we're discussing here. But if price is no object, I would choose the CSDD and DD Plus over the DD1 and DD2. So look, I think that's pretty much all that I can offer in terms of initial impressions with these guys. I will definitely absolutely be looping back and giving you some more head-to-head style comparisons between these and the guys you see behind me once we have that final software available and we're able to really test out FullForce and see exactly what it's capable of. I do have a feeling that that may change my feelings and that may end up pushing this a little bit further forward, but we can only test, of course, with what we've been sent. So suffice to say for now that I am suitably impressed with both of these guys. Just to answer the final question that I know a lot of you guys are wondering, strength between the two of them, if you don't need that PlayStation compatibility, is it worth paying that extra for the DD Plus over the DD standard? Now, look, I mean, it really just comes down to personal preference. There is a slight noticeable difference in the overall sharpness of the force feedback as represented by that graph that we saw earlier on. In a blind test, I'd probably get it right maybe 6 out of 10 times. It doesn't feel massively more responsive or massively sharper. It's stepping up to that 15 Newton meters of torque over the 12. And look, in terms of strength, honestly, I think 12 Newton meters is strong enough for the vast majority of people. Remembering again, it is holding torque, not peak torque, so that definitely should be considered. I think if you're trying to relate the torque levels here back to some of the wheelbases that advertise peak torque, I'd say that the DD Plus is probably more similar to, say, like an 18, 19, 20 Newton meter peak wheelbase, and the 12 Newton meter is more similar to a 15, 16 Newton meter peak wheelbase for a more direct comparison. So the CSDD is probably more similar to, say, for example, a Moza R16 rather than an R12, for example. So just make sure you factor that in to your considerations as well. And I think that pretty much wraps everything up for today's video, guys. So do let us know down in the comments below if you do have any further questions at all. I am reading them all. I'll respond to as many as I possibly can, and we'll do our absolute best to answer as many questions as we possibly can and as much detail as we can when we dive back into these guys once we have our hands on final software and FullForce is integrated into some games. So again, just a quick reminder, guys, if you do find our work here at Boosted Media useful and you want to pick up either of these guys or any of the other gear that we've talked about in today's video, we do have some affiliate links down in the description below. Those are an awesome obligation-free way to help us out here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. And that's just a way that you guys can help support us if you find what we do here of value. But thank you very much for watching as always, guys. If you find the content valuable, please do consider subscribing to the channel as well. I know that it doesn't make a huge difference these days to what you guys see in your news feed, but it definitely does make a huge difference in terms of what YouTube pushes out to other people that haven't seen our content before. So if you found the content useful and you want to make sure as many people see it as possible, the thumbs up and the subscription button are a fantastic way of doing so. But thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'm going to go get some sleep now. I'm absolutely shattered. We'll see you guys again very soon. Bye.